Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar series titled Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry. This is the second of the series. The first was held in August 2020 with Iris van der Toon and her postgraduate student, Amy Peckel. And if you're interested in seeing it, it's now available on YouTube. You can find it on the website if you'd like to access it. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sent notices of them. So just a bit of background. This free webinar series is a year-long virtual space on Zoom that meets monthly on the topic of post-qualitative inquiry and the doing of inquiry, inspired by a range of post-philosophies. Each session involves one or two international guests who have experience with inquiry approaches inspired by post-philosophies, such as post-humanism, post-structuralism, affect theories, feminist new materialism, and post-colonialism. I'm Viv Bozalek, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm co-hosting this webinar with Candace Kuby. This webinar series is made possible by a collaborative partnership between our universities. That's the University of Missouri and the University of Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. The partnership between our universities started ages ago in 1986, and funding for the webinar series is provided through the University of Missouri South African Education Program, otherwise known as UMSAEP, which supports academic exchanges between the University of Missouri system and UWC, and provides opportunities for teaching and learning, research, and community engagement between the two universities. And Candace and I are very grateful to our university's long-time collaboration and support for this webinar series. And today we're delighted to have Elizabeth or Bettie St.Pierre, Professor of Critical Studies in Educational Theory and Practice Department and affiliated professor of both the Interdisciplinary Qualitative Research Program and the Institute of Women's Studies at the University of Georgia. Very big welcome to you, Bettie.
Thank you.
I would also like to introduce today Erin Price, who's an instructor and a doctoral student at the University of Missouri with me. She serves as a graduate research assistant alongside my work here at Mizzou. Erin is an artist and an art educator with experiences coordinating preschool through secondary art education in U.S. public schools, as well as community-based explorations at home and abroad. Erin is particularly interested in intersections of art and inquiry, including the role of material and invitations, affect, and artistic encounters, and the becoming of identity in communities. Erin is providing a lot of technical support for this webinar series to happen, and today she's going to help assist us specifically with helping us to moderate all of the questions that will come in for the Q&A portion today. I also want to note that the beautiful artwork that is on the webinar series webpage and all of our promotional materials was created by Erin. So thank you, Erin, for that beautiful artwork and for your support of the webinar series, and welcome.
Thank you. It's my privilege to be a part of these series, and now I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce our co-hosts. Vivienne Bozalek is an emerita professor in women's and gender studies at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa. She also is an honorary professor at the Center for Higher Education Research, Teaching and Learning at Rhodes University. She holds a PhD from Utrecht University, and her research interests and publications include the political ethics of care and social justice, post-humanism and feminist new materialisms, and innovative pedagogical practices in higher education post. Her most recent co-edited books include Theorizing Learning to Teach in Higher Education and Socially Just Pedagogies, Post-Humanist, Feminist, and Materialist Perspectives in Higher Education. So we are so grateful to have Viv and all of her experience, as well as Dr. Candace Kuby, Associate Professor of Learning, Teaching, and Curriculum at the University of Missouri. She also serves as department chair and director of Qualitative Inquiry. And Dr. Kuby's research interests are the coming to be of literacies when young children work with artistic and digital tools of qualitative inquiry when thinking with post-structural and post-humanist philosophies. She's the co-author of several books, including Speculative Pedagogies of Qualitative Inquiry and Disrupting Qualitative Inquiry, Possibilities and Tensions in Educational Research. Her scholarship appears in journals including Qualitative Inquiry, International Journal of Qualitative Studies in Education, and Cultural Studies Critical Methodologies. I just want to say on behalf of myself and so many other people who have reached out to me with excitement about this series, we are so grateful for this space and this opportunity to learn from the wonderful panelists that you have invited.
Yeah.
Erin.
Thanks, Erin. I just want to give another overview of Zoom. I know that Candace did it before, but people are joining all the time. As you might have noticed, we're using the Zoom webinar platform instead of the meeting platform so that we can accommodate a larger number of people attending this session. So as you will probably have noticed, only the hosts and panelists have the video and audio functions. But we are recording this webinar for public viewing, as I said, later on YouTube. The chat function is open for you to connect with other attendees during the webinar. And we request, though, that any question that you have for the panelists, you put into the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen in the right-hand corner. So this will make it easier for us to moderate the questions. So we're not sort of jumping between chat and the QA function. So please do take a minute to locate where this icon button is on your screen. Just in terms of the structure, so for the first 30 to 40 minutes, Candace will interview Betty on 4 main questions, which is our common thread for all the webinars in this series. And you can also find them on our webpage. While discussing these questions, Betty might also share examples from her scholarship and the suggested readings that we've posted on our website. And then Candace will spend some time talking with Betty on how she mentors and teaches her graduate students while they engage in post-philosophies in the doing of inquiry. And we want this webinar series to open up spaces for conversations that aren't discussed publicly on how to really navigate the academy and the doing of these sorts of inquiries. And then lastly, we're going to open up a space for questions from attendees to Betty. And we hope to have about 30 minutes for this. So we're inviting you to actually, throughout the webinar, jot down your questions that you can ask when we come to the question and answer portion. And we're going to moderate those through Zoom, not through chat, as we said. And we'll do our best, if we get lots of questions, to put the similar questions together so that we get a variety of topics.
Thanks, Bev, and thanks, Erin. So we're going to jump in now, Betty.
Okay.
So I want to introduce you a little more. So we are so grateful today to have Dr. Elizabeth St.Pierre with us, also known as Betty. She is a professor in critical studies and educational theory and practice, and also an affiliate professor of both the Interdisciplinary Qualitative Research Program and the Institute of Women's Studies at the University of Georgia. Betty's work focuses on theories of language and human being from post-structural theories and what she has called post-qualitative inquiry, what might come after conventional humanist qualitative research methodology. She's especially interested in the new empiricism, the new materialism, and the post-human enabled by the ontological turn. So I must say, Betty, I am delighted to have this conversation with you today. I was really excited a couple springs ago for me, I think spring of 2018, I was able to participate in a course you taught called Post-Qualitative Inquiry. It was such a rigorous course with lots of readings and a lot of space to think through this idea of post-qualitative inquiry, where it came from and how it's grown over time. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. And thanks to all of you who are organizing and making this webinar work. I know our students and colleagues are happy to get together to have a space to talk. Excuse me. I want to explain where my work comes from, because I think it's important to provide that historical background of how we come to academia, what's there when we come, who we study with, what we read, and how all of that disciplines us for the rest of the work we do during our careers. Because having read a lot of Foucault, I know that academia does discipline us. So some background for me is that I started my doctoral program in 1991 at Ohio State, and I studied with Patty Lather and Laurel Richardson there. They were two feminists promoting and inventing qualitative research at the same time, and they were also making the postmodern turn at that time. Judith Butler had published Gender Trouble in 1990. I began studying theory by studying second wave feminist theory, as well as the work of the feminists who were making that postmodern turn. Butler certainly studied Donna Haraway, Gayatri Spivak. It was an exciting moment because we were coming out of the social movements of the 1960s and 70s, and the rich body of theory that was beginning to be organized and thought around race theories, queer theory, all kinds of feminist theories, and so on. So identity, a particular description of human being, a human with an identity that could be divided into identity categories. If you think about that, identity categories, this was the description of the human being that was popular at that time. But that description of human being was also being critiqued by post-structural, postmodern scholars. And when I say postmodern and post-structural, I want to say that the scholars that I have studied and find exciting for my work are those French continental philosophers, Foucault, Derrida, Deleuze, Baudrillard, Lyotard, and so on. Their work is very different. They disagree. They have different projects, yet at the same time, we group them under those larger categories of postmodern and post-structural, which is always dangerous, of course. As Butler says, we need to read and read carefully so that we're not conflating or mixing or not attending to the specificity of a scholar's work. So I began reading feminist theory. Feminist theory took me to post-structural theory, and it just seemed to be very productive and provocative for me. Thinking back about that now, I believe one of the reasons it was so appealing was that it is so open, it offers so much room and demands that we think and think differently. It is never still. The other thing about it that I know I really valued was the ontology of post-structuralism, postmodernism, an immanentist ontology that I certainly didn't understand at the time, and that I'm still not sure I understand, but that it is very attractive and very appealing, as well as its different description of human being. So that's where I began. And I'm sure that what I read as a doctoral student and what I studied has influenced everything since then. The other thing that I was studying simultaneously but separately was qualitative research, which at that point was radical, new, exciting, challenging. We were having to justify doing a qualitative study at that point. And as doctoral students, we were scaring each other by saying, oh, if you do a qualitative study, you won't get a job. So just as students today are scaring themselves by saying, oh, if we do something too different, like a new material study or a post-qualitative study, we won't get a job. Well, we got jobs. So every period, every time period when you enter the academy, you're dealing with something that's dogmatic and traditional and conventional. And at the same time, there's a resistance that is being organized against that. So I just want to say that for the students who are listening today, that we've all encountered those, what we think are limits, but I do want to say also that I think students scare themselves, and that sometimes unnecessarily. So I'm always advising, do the radical, do the different, take the risk, be experimental, do that. In the long run, it'll pay off. So that's where I started studying qualitative methodology, which was exciting, and studying post-structuralism also. The theory and the methodology were separated. They were separated. The qualitative research I was studying was basically some kind of bizarre mixture of, it was still positivist in a sense. It was trying to make this interpretive turn, and it was trying to make a more emancipatory turn. But I see qualitative research at that time and now still confused in its onto-epistemological attachments, at any rate. I've been in academia. This is my 26th year in academia. And if you count the 4 years of my doctoral program, that's 30 years. And I think once you've had that long a career, you can look back over what you've done and kind of see the movement or what has happened during your career that has caused you to do the work you do. So I think I had this period of excitement, of early period of deconstructing qualitative research, because even in my dissertation, qualitative research didn't work. The options for me as a doctoral student were to do a qualitative study or a quantitative study. There was nothing called mixed methods at that point. And I knew very well that I wasn't going to do a quantitative study because I can't do numbers and mathematics. And I was absolutely thrilled that qualitative research was possible. And then I could write, that qualitative research was about writing because I love to write. So there was no doubt but that I would do a qualitative study. I was studying with two really fine qualitative researchers, and I designed and did a big qualitative interview study with older women who lived in my hometown. And I also did an ethnography of that community. So it was a rich and wonderful qualitative study. It never dawned on me that if I was actually using the post-structural theory that I was reading and studying, I probably would not have done a qualitative study. So what I just went to the field and did the interviewing and did the observation and did all the things you're supposed to do as a good qualitative researcher. And it all fell apart when I started writing. When I started writing my dissertation, I realized the incommensurability between the theories I had written about, say in chapter 2 of my dissertation in the literature review, and the methodology I was writing in chapter 3. There was this enormous lack of fit. But at that point, it's like it was too late and I didn't know what to do. I did want to graduate on time. And so my resolution to that problem was to write a very conventional chapter 3, explaining what I did and how I did it and why I did it, and then to deconstruct it. So the part of the chapter 3 that is a straight ahead description of the qualitative study I did is called Methods Are Easy. And the deconstruction is titled Folding is Hard. So in that section, I was using Deleuze's concept of the fold, as well as Derrida's deconstruction, to deconstruct the interview, deconstruct data, deconstruct the idea of the field as something out there away from us. And near the end of that section, I wrote a sentence that I want to read if I can find it here. Near the end of chapter 3, I wrote, I believe the persistent critique urged by post-structuralism enables a transition from traditional methodology to something different, and am not too concerned at this time with naming whatever might be produced. But in 2004, I developed a new doctoral course called Post-Modern Qualitative Research. I named it Post-Modern Qualitative Research. But in that course for, probably five or six times, what we did in that course was simply to deconstruct all the concepts and categories of qualitative research. We weren't really doing anything different, just using postmodernism to deconstruct qualitative research and to show its impossibility, if that makes sense. Around 2000, this is one of those historical events that changes your career. The No Child Left Behind Act was passed, and I don't know whether you have much history with that, but the federal government mandated in federal law in the US that the gold standard, the gold standard of educational research is randomized controlled trials. So this was the first time in our history the government had intervened in methodology in this country, particularly in education. So there was this huge resistance to that, and I got caught up in that. And probably for 5 or 6 years, everything I wrote was refusing positivism, refusing positivist research, and so on. It's as if those of us who were doing that resistance pretty much abandoned our own work, and started this resistance movement, kind of getting sucked back into all of this. I remember that Patty Lather came here to UGA, I think it was in 2008 or 2009, and she and our wonderful qualitative research faculty here at UGA, who offer us really fine certificate program, were sitting around a table just so bored and so tired of having to call out the positivists and so on. And Patty looked around the room and said, I think we're just all cranky and crabby, and we should just forget all of this and start doing what we want to do. So we kind of gave ourselves permission to abandon the fight and just get on with our work, because we didn't really think much was going to change. We actually had to get a new director of education sciences in this country to have something a little more reasonable. But at that point, if you were doing qualitative research in this country, you could get no federal funding. So I was actually protecting what I was finding impossible. But that's the way politics goes in this work we do. But post-structuralism was still there all over my work. I was using post-structuralist critiques to deconstruct positivism and to resist. And in 2010, I began Norman Denson asked me if I would write a chapter for whatever that handbook was at that point, the qualitative handbook. And I said yes, and he wanted me to write a chapter on validity. And I said, Norman, I don't even believe in validity. I can't write that chapter. But I could write a chapter called Post-Qualitative Research. And he said, okay. So I started writing that chapter, and I ended up writing about 125 pages. And I thought, well, I think that's too long for a chapter, but I think I have something to say. And so I had to reduce it to a chapter that was called Post-Qualitative Research. So I wrote that in 2010 and also presented my first conference paper on post-qualitative research at AERA that year. And then I began to invent post-qualitative research in my writing, journal articles and chapters and so on. So I've probably written, I counted up last night, 25 or 30 journal articles and chapters about post-qualitative, which I now call post-qualitative inquiry. I have given up the word research because I've learned that research just throws people right back into methodology. And I do want to say here that post-qualitative inquiry is not a methodology. It is not another kind of qualitative methodology. And I think that can be very confusing for people. And I think it's telling that we want to put inquiry within the methodological framework. So all of that, Candace, is to try to situate question one. So, and probably all the rest of them, to say that post-structuralism is where I always begin, and post-structuralism is where post-qualitative inquiry begins. It does not begin with methodology. So that's how post-structuralism influences the doing of inquiry for me. And that has a long history. This didn't happen overnight. My doctoral program started in 1991, and it wasn't until 2010 that I wrote the first paper about post-qualitative research, and so on. So there's a long history, a long preparation to get ready to do these things.
Well, one thing I want to say from listening to that, Betty, is first, thank you for that, the context and the history over time. And I think I also heard you say something to the effect of, I'm still reading and writing about this, but I don't always understand it. And I think I'm giving ourselves permission that we don't always understand, but you're still engaged in the work over many decades. So that's refreshing for me to hear, because I often feel like I don't understand. And giving ourselves permission for that is helpful. So I think that context helps us with our first question. And I think in a sense you've answered this question about how your philosophical approach influences your ways of doing inquiry. So I wanted to ask a follow-up to that related to one of the suggested readings that you shared with us. So there's a suggested reading, I think it might have been an introduction to a special issue with Alicia Jackson and Lisa Mazzei, the new and new materialisms, conditions for new inquiry. And so one thing I've learned a lot from your writing, Betty, is the way that you synthesize and talk across different post-philosophers, specifically the discussion about the subject and how that matters or relates to things like language, representation, identity. And in this piece, the three of you talk about Deleuze's warning against dogmatic image of thought, and laying out a plane and creating concepts. And you mentioned it in relation to Descartes' idea of the knowing subject. So in the piece, you talk a little bit about how Deleuze warned us against dogmatic image of thought, whether one begins with the subject or the object, one nevertheless begins in the dualism in which they are separate. So I think from reading your work, I hear this refrain a lot about the subject, and how we conceptualize the subject matters so much, and how to go about doing inquiry inspired by post-structuralist theory. So can you talk a little bit more about why that matters so much in how you think about the doing of inquiry?
I think what attracted me to post-structuralism and the post-structural theorists to begin with was that they did introduce a different description of human being. So the description of human being that typically informs research methodology is a Cartesian cogito, the knowing subject. I think, therefore I am. It's not I ride a bicycle, therefore I am, or I love my mother, therefore I am. It's that I think, therefore I am. Susan Borda, one of our finest feminist theorists, explained in some of her critique of Descartes that in the medieval period, this line between human being and the rest of being was not so strong. It was very ambiguous. There was more of a sense of relatedness between human being and the rest of being. But Descartes really sets that line, draws that line between mind, the human, self, and other, the rest of the world, the passive natural world that's inactive and passive and stable. It's the human, it's the rational mind of man, certainly not woman, the rational mind of man that can think and produce knowledge. So having grown up in a culture in which that rational man dominated my life as a woman, certainly from being a girl all the way through two careers before I began in academia, I felt oppressed by that man, that Cartesian subject, dominating everything. And so when I found feminist theory, one of the most powerful critiques for me was the feminist critique of that particular description of human being. And the post-structuralists, of course, take that critique more radically. They talk about the death of the subject. Foucault wrote about the death of the author. So they're not saying that the human being is dead. They're describing human being differently. Human being that is not separate from the world. The human is not superior to the world or to nature. The human being exists with nature. And I think Nietzsche's work is the best description here. Nietzsche says that the doer does not precede the deed. So I use this I'm an ex-English teacher, so I use this sentence, John hit the ball, John hit the ball. Because of the grammar of the English language, we put John before hitting the ball. So we think John exists, and then John hits the ball. But as Nietzsche says, John only exists in hitting the ball. John exists in the moment of hitting the ball. So he's not separate from time or space or the ball or anything else. And I mean, I think that's a simple way to describe a very different way of being in the world. And we get at that. They're not the same thing, but Deleuze's, some of Deleuze's philosophical concepts are useful here. Barad's entanglement, these ideas have existed forever and have existed certainly in indigenous thought, the idea that the human is not separate from the world. So that's becoming even more and more important than ever in the era of the Anthropocene, and the idea that this human can conquer and master the world. And of course, that's what science tries to do. Science is supposed to master, conquer, know. So feminists rejected that. The post-structuralists rejected that. And much of the new work rejects that subject, that description of human being as well. But it still centers qualitative research. Qualitative research still requires a researcher at the beginning of the work, a researcher at the beginning of the work, the researcher who has a question, the researcher who designs a study, the researcher who collects data, the researcher who analyzes data. So the typical qualitative methodological process requires the doer before the deed, the knower before the knowledge. And if you give up that particular description of human being, qualitative research makes no sense, nor does any kind of pre-existing methodology. So the subject was the linchpin in my thought. It's the quilting point, the point capsule. You pull that subject and the whole structure falls apart. Language was the second piece of that, the Derridian understanding of language. So you pull both of those apart. The idea that language can represent, language can contain meaning. It can close off, you can close off meaning into language, and that language can represent the world. Language exists on a different plane so that it can represent the world. You mess with both of those ideas, and qualitative research or any other kind of methodology just makes no sense. So those were the two key concepts that destroyed qualitative research for me.
So this relates to our second question that we're asking our panelists for the series is, what does the philosophical approach or the theories that you draw upon make thinkable or possible for inquiry? So I'm hearing a little bit of that, but maybe speak a little bit more directly, because as you've talked about your history over time as a doctoral student to now, and often these phrases we hear in qualitative and quantitative research too, around literature reviews, you have to find your research question first. It's very linear. Data, what's possible or thinkable with that, and even analysis. So talk with us a little bit about how, over time your thinking has shifted and changed as you've read more and thought more about what is possible or thinkable for the doing of inquiry.
Well, I have pretty much just given up the whole qualitative research process. It doesn't make sense to me at all. I've written many papers critiquing data. I'm really, really interested in data. I think it's a lovely concept to think about. But if you don't believe you're separate from the world, I'm not sure how you can separate yourself from the world to collect data. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. If you've got this human being that's intimately and constantly in relation with everything else, I don't know how you can separate it from the world and then go collect data out in the world. That has never made sense to me. So I've deconstructed data in quite a few papers. Alicia Jackson and I, Alicia is one of my former students. Alicia and I were so tired of doc students asking us, so if we're not going to code data, what do we do? That we decided to guest edit a special issue of Qualitative Inquiry called Qualitative Data Analysis After Coding. And we invited a lot of people to write little short papers on what they do with data other than code it. I mean, I can't imagine anybody coding data unless somebody taught you to do it. I just don't see that it's something you would do. So I think my general feeling about qualitative methodology is that it continues to exist because we teach it. You have to understand that methodology is big business. Qualitative methodology is a big business. I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of textbooks there are on qualitative methodology right now, but everybody writes one. Everybody has to write their own qual methodology book or something about methodology. Editors want you to put method or methodology in the titles of your books so they'll sell. There's an industry around qualitative methodology, conferences. Think of all the publications we have now. It's just a big business, and we teach it. We perpetuate it in our teaching. Our doctoral students have to take, at my university, many more research courses than they do theory courses. So if you begin with methodology, you're going to be stuck in methodology. My desire is to get a group of doctoral students who've never had a methodology course. So they haven't already been trained. They don't already have that structure in their minds. And think about inquiry. So the literature review, as far as I'm concerned, is research on its own. I mean, if you have any background in the humanities, I mean, that's what you do in lit crit, history, and so on. You read the literature and write some kind of review of the literature. So that's research on its own. The rest of the qualitative research project, it just doesn't make any sense to me.
So one of the suggested readings is a really new piece of yours called, I believe it's called Why Post-Qualitative Inquiry, right. And it was just out, I think, in the online first version here in 2020. And there is a part at the very end. Well, the piece is interesting because it seems like the editors for this collection asked for writers to answer 2 questions. Right. And you spend most of that article on one question. And then the last paragraph of the piece, you come to their second question, which is, why do you think post-qualitative inquiry is important to qualitative inquiry? And by that part in the article, you say, well, I've kind of made my case on that. And you list a series of hopes, what you hope post-qualitative inquiry will do or open up space for. So maybe talk with us a little bit about if we're refusing qualitative research, the methods and methodologies, what's the hopefulness of this notion of post-qualitative inquiry?
Well, when I teach post-qualitative inquiry, and I teach it every couple of years, of course, I've learned everything from my students. I always say I've done my reading, but it's in teaching and working with doctoral students on their committees and as their advisors that work has guided my career as much as anything else. Doctoral students who take the post-qualitative course with me will say, well, Betty, if I'm not going to do what qualitative methodology tells me to do, then what should I do? And I always say, I could just quote Foucault, there are 1,000 things to do. There are 1,000 things to do. I can't tell you what to do. I can't tell you what inquiry is. And my advice to them is always to read theory, read history, find a set of scholars or one scholar and go deep, become an expert in something, put methodology aside, do your reading, come back in a year and we'll talk about your dissertation. And when they come back in a year, if they've done their reading, they know what they want to do. They don't need methodology. They have some ideas about what they want to read, what they want to study, what they want to think about. They have a topic, but they don't need methodology. They don't need methodology. So I can tell you some of my current doctoral students. One went to the philosophy department here and took a course on Henri Bergson. Her dissertation is informed by Bergson. Another came from English and brought Walter Benjamin with him. His work is using Benjamin's theories. Another is deep into Whitehead and using Whitehead in her dissertation. These are not qualitative studies. These are not qualitative studies. This is not to say that these students might not be talking with people. I mean, that's something we do every day. It's not to say that they're not observing people. That's something we do every day, but that's not the focus of their work. Something in the world, as Deleuze wrote, something in the world forces you to think. I think it was Barad who wrote, the world kicks back. So something has prompted your curiosity. Foucault says something seems cracked or puzzling in your life and you want to think about it. So you would do all the things that you might do to think about something. But the interview, if you think about it, is just a conversation with a person. And yet it's been magnified and become this monster called the interview with a capital I. That's the way I think about it. And now we've got handbooks of interviewing. How many hundreds of books on interviewing do we have? We teach courses on interviewing. We've made interviewing this huge thing, elaborated all out of proportion. That's what I think. Same thing with observation. So these ordinary, everyday things we do have become methodologized. It's as if we have to methodologize any human activity. In fact, I was on a doctoral committee of a student in another discipline, and the professor, one of the professors on the committee said, after I had said to the student, perhaps you don't need methodology in this study. And she was very, very upset that I said that and said, I believe we should methodologize everything. And I thought, well, there you go. There you go. We should methodologize everything. So think about narrative. Narrative has a long history, but we bring it over into social science research methodology and we have narrative analysis. Think about discourse, which is an old concept out there in the humanities. We bring it into social science and it becomes discourse analysis. And now we have all kinds of methodology textbooks around these. So it's very difficult to leave methodology behind. But if you do, it's interesting. What I find very interesting is what students do. And they're very inventive and very creative. So some people are talented in art, as Erin is, and other people are talented as writers. I have students from science ed students, math ed students, students who've studied history. And they go to those disciplines and find ways of thinking. And so they're inventing and they're creating their own kind of thing. So that's what I'm interested in. Not to tell people what to do, but to encourage people to create and invent and experiment.
So our third question is around this whole notion of methodology and methods, which we've talked a good bit about. And so you've also shared a good bit about what you encourage your students to do. So the piece that you suggested that you co-authored with Lisa and Alicia, you talk a little bit about how all of this notion of method and the slowing down of reading and thinking might lead us to question how we teach this work. And more to the point, you say what to avoid teaching. So maybe talk with us a little bit, especially for those who are joining us who find themselves in courses in the academy, maybe labeled as qualitative research or in these other structures and categories and labels. What might we avoid teaching students who are interested in doing this work, post-qual work?
Well, I'd say avoid taking qualitative research courses that limit you, that define in advance what inquiry is. Qualitative research is a pre-existing, self-evident research methodology that we made up. We invented it. In 1991, when I started studying qualitative research, it did not look like what it looks like now. It has been elaborated so much since then, and it has been kind of solidified. You know exactly what you should do first, second, third, and so on. You drop down into the methodology at the beginning and you follow the recipe to the end, and you've got your dissertation research. So I would prefer that students begin, and we actually have done this in our qualitative research program here. Melissa Freeman, one of our really fine qualitative researchers, has developed the first course, if you're thinking about inquiry, the first course in the history and philosophy of social science. So we're in the social sciences, if you think about it, human, social, empirical sciences, but we don't study empiricism. We don't study empiricism. I mean, I think we should take a course in empiricism. We should take a course in ontology. We study a lot of epistemology at universities because we're big knowledge production machines. I wrote a comprehensive exam paper on feminist epistemologies many years ago. So epistemology is right here in front of us all the time. But ontology, which is what much of this new work is about, is not taught. So courses in ontology, courses in empiricism, courses in the history of the social sciences, so that we get a sense of how these social sciences developed. Reading Foucault's The Order of Things and Archaeology of the Human Sciences, where he explains that history. To get a sense that what we're doing is not necessarily good, it's not normal, it's not natural. If you think about Thomas Kuhn, we're stuck in a particular kind of paradigm that's become normal, qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods. How have we become limited by that methodological enclosure? I mean, Erin Writing says that methodology is an apparatus of capture, and I truly believe that. Once you're captured by methodology, it's really hard to put it aside, just to put it aside and say, okay, that's something that can be done, but what else could be done? If we forget methodology, can we just put it aside? So my ideal curriculum would be history, philosophy of social science and science, studying empiricism if people want to do empirical kinds of work, reconnecting with philosophy and history, and studying ways of inquiry that have existed in the humanities forever, reading and writing, and just exploring and inventing and using all the creative abilities of our wonderful doctoral students who come from many other disciplines. So education itself is this really rich place. You know, we are not as disciplined in education as you might be in history or rhetoric or other disciplines. We take people from everywhere. So we have this rich group of people we can think with, but we just get locked up in methodology. So I would prefer that students not take any methodology classes until they've studied history and philosophy of social sciences and so on, and read some theory. And at that point then, after they have read and thought, then it's time to think about, so what do you want to focus on now and write a dissertation about? And whether you want to talk to people, or whether you want to observe people, or whether you want to count something or measure something, that would be an individual decision, but that there wouldn't necessarily have to be courses. You know, I think you could read one really good intro to qual course and that might be all you need. Intro to qual book, and that might be all you need to get a sense of what it is.
And I noticed in the post-qual inquiry piece that you had as a suggested reading, you also talk a little bit about assignments. And one that really struck me as an example was a more appropriate assignment might be asking a student to trace concept. And the one you use in the article is matter through different philosophical traditions over time, through different philosophers. And so I think also as instructors, it's important not only the types of class we're offering, but also what are the kinds of assignments or what are we asking students to do and engage in? And how does that align with what we're hoping?
Yeah, I developed a course on new empiricism and new materialism that I've been teaching for a while. And the last time I taught it last year, I start the course with Descartes because he so clearly separates mind and matter. And the more we read, the more we realized we needed to start with Aristotle, who wrote about matter. So some of the students in the class did some studying and taught us Aristotle's concept of matter. I don't know how you do new materialism if you don't understand materialism and the history of materialism. So leaping into new materialism, I think, is dangerous. I did look, as a librarian, I'm always looking to see what books are out there. I found this great book on Amazon called The History of Materialism and a Critique of Its Current Significance. And I thought, that's the book. I'm going to use this book next time I teach the new materialism course. But this book was published in 1866. So in 1866, this guy, Frederick Lang, wrote a book called The History of Materialism. And I thought, well, we could at least know the history of materialism to 1866, and then we'd have to follow it from there to now. So materialism is this old, ancient concept, and to think we can just pop right into new materialism now just seems pretty arrogant to me. There's a lot to read, a lot to study. So another concept that you could track the history of would be empiricism or ontology. I mean, these are real philosophical concepts, but I think in the social sciences, we're always trying to learn something quickly and apply it. So a student will take a course on Foucault and then say that they read 2 of Foucault's books and 20 essays, and at the end of the course, they're supposed to apply Foucault. You can't apply Foucault after, reading Foucault for 16 weeks. It's impossible. But that's what we do in the academy. That's what we do in the applied sciences. In the applied sciences, we apply, and I think we ask students to apply too quickly. We ask ourselves to apply too quickly. We need to read a lot more before we try to do something. Reading is doing, of course, but I think the good work out there, you can see the depth of the reading in that really good work, that people know what they're talking about.
So I want to pivot to our 4th question, and after that we'll open up to some Q&A time with our attendees today. But our 4th question, really, I guess a catalyst with Viv and I, we're putting this webinar together, is to really think about trying to make transparent some conversations in the academy and conversations around can you hear me? Is my mic working?
You went out there
okay.
For a second.
I had a little note on my Zoom that it was out, but so we really were hoping this webinar would open a space for conversations around how do we do this work and navigate dissertation committees? How do we do this work and think about publishing in the academy?
Sure.
How do we do this
Sure.
work about grant
Sure.
funding? So talk with us a little bit about how you mentor students or advice you give students. I know you've written a good number of pieces related to this about navigating the politics of the academy if people are interested in being up to the kind of work that you're talking about.
Well, I think it's good for students to learn right away that everything's political. Everything's political in the academy. I advise students to find advisors who will help them do what they want to do and not get in the way too much. And I advise students to hold off on choosing dissertation committee members until they have a sense of what they want to do, and to find committee members who will support them in doing something new and different. I also explain to them that I don't want to read any more boring dissertations. When I get that email with a dissertation attached, it's like, oh no, here goes a week of my life reading something so boring. So write something that I want to read. Write something interesting. Do some interesting work and then write about it beautifully so that you engage me and it's solid and I can tell that you've done your reading and you've thought about it. I really believe that scholars in academia will accept and enjoy something different if it's good. If it's good. So it has to be good, and whatever counts as good, of course, we could debate that forever. But I think we do recognize solid, innovative work, and I also advise students to be pedagogical. It's your job to teach us too. Help us follow you in your work. Give us the rationale for what you're doing. Help us understand it. Be a good writer. Hold the reader's hand as you write so that we're following you. Be convincing. All of that is about good writing. And I think that's one of the most important things for doctoral students, is to get a handle on their writing. I always say, take as many writing courses as you can. Read all the books about writing. And most importantly, write, just like you read. So read, write. Do something interesting. Stay in touch with your committee so that they know what you're doing. Don't hit them with something totally wild and creative and they're not ready. And then the same thing when you're getting a job. You always have to sell yourself in academia. You can't be too humble. You have to sell yourself. You have to explain to somebody the work you're doing, and so they kind of understand it when you're giving a job talk. We usually don't like to hire people who look like us, so show us how you're different, but how you can work with us. I think it's about marketing yourself. Now, what's happened to post-qual, which is kind of interesting. I saw this, maybe it was 2015, I saw that in the AERA call for proposals in Division D, which is research methodology, post-qual had been added as a methodology, which is not right, but it's fine because I've got students coming through who are going to advertise themselves as knowing how to do post-qualitative work. So I say, take the label and use it. Saying that you can teach post-qual might, as well as qual, might help get you a job. But I don't think you should shut yourself down as a doctoral student. You shouldn't shut down that early in your academic career. Do your fabulous work then and keep doing it. Don't be afraid. We'll figure out how to sell you. You'll have to do that your whole career. You're going up for awards. You're going up for promotion and tenure. So do good work right away, and don't be afraid of it. And I have an 800 number you can call if you need a pep talk.
Are you going to post that in the chat for us today?
But I'm really happy to, talk with students about that, because you shouldn't be scared during your doctoral program. That should be exciting and wonderful when you're really creative and experimental. Remember, not many people are going to read your dissertation. Who's going to read your dissertation? Only the people who really love you. So you could probably do a lot more in that dissertation work than you think you can do.
Well, thank you for exploring these 4 questions with us. We're excited to hear how different panelists throughout the whole series respond and share their thinking and insights around those. We want to turn now to opening up our Q&A for all of our guests, our attendees that are with us today. I just want to remind those, in case you came in after we announced this earlier, that there are 2 functions on the Zoom webinar platform. One is the chat, which I know people have found because I can see a lot of those popping up as we've been talking. And then there's the Q&A button that's also on the bottom of the screen. So we're going to ask for you to put your questions there. I know that there's at least 8 that I can see right now, so people have been putting some in as Bettie's been talking. But it's hard for myself and Viv and Erin to go back and forth between the chat and the Q&A function. And so we're going to ask that if you want a question asked to Bettie, that you put it in that Q&A box there. As we said earlier, we might get several questions around the same topic, and so we'll work to kind of put those together so that we can open up space for a greater variety of the kinds of questions that Bettie's getting asked. So I guess Viv or Erin, whichever one's going to start us off with some of the questions, if you'll go ahead and begin this time.
Thanks, Candace. I'm looking at some questions about methodology, method, and I know you call it inquiry. We call it inquiry here in South Africa. So the first question is, I'm not sure that I fully understand how post-qualitative inquiry is not a methodology. I understand it's not a method, but I'm not sure I follow Dr. St.Pierre's distinction between PQI and methodology. Is it that the construct methodology just carries too much positivist baggage? And I know you have said that in the past, Bettie. I would like to read the second question too, because I think it relates to the first. You mentioned that using the word research confuses folks. So you've shifted to inquiry. You also mentioned that post-qual is not qualitative research, and it doesn't start with methodology. I think this too confuses people. Why not jettison the word qualitative from post-qualitative too? Doesn't keeping it just anchor it to previous notions that are grounded in empirical qualitative research? So can we start off with those 2?
Yeah. I think the name post-qualitative inquiry can be troubling for some people. It's not for me, of course, because this is the way it developed or it emerged or the way I invented it. Post-qualitative inquiry for me began as that critique of qualitative research, a post-structural critique and refusal of qualitative research. So that's where the title comes from. The title certainly could have been different, but it does have its origin in the critique of in the critique of qualitative, just as all those post concepts. Post-humanism is a post-structural critique of humanism. Post-Fordism, a post-structural critique of Fordism. But the post has 2 meanings. It's the post-structural critique of something. It also means coming after in the chronological sense. So post-qualitative research come as a critique of and a coming after qualitative research. So I understand that confusion. I think it's interesting that people do want to call post-qualitative inquiry a method or a methodology. And again, I think that is just because whenever we think of inquiry or inquiry, we think of methodology, that those two concepts have been so linked for so long that we can't think of thinking of inquiry without putting it somehow in that methodological enclosure. And it's really hard to do this. It was really hard for me. I was so well trained as a qualitative methodologist that it took forever. I remember writing an AERA paper. I haven't found it yet. I'm still looking for it. An AERA paper that I end it with, perhaps we could start somewhere else from the beginning. That was the first time I thought, I don't have to start inquiry with methodology. I don't have to begin it with methodology. I can start inquiry, and I do every minute of the day, somewhere else. So if you take methodology, the structure, you move it aside, then here you are in this other space where you can begin to inquire, where you have probably already begun to inquire. So students do come to me and say, qualitative research is not working. This was a big incentive for me to think about it. Students would come to my office, they'd sit down, some almost in tears. Dr. St.Pierre, I just can't interview anybody. And I'd say, that's fine, you don't have to interview anybody. And all of a sudden they'd kind of perk up and I'd say, well, what do you want to do? And they always had something else they wanted to do. So this was like where a lot of this began with me, was working with students who just could not do what we were asking them to do. It didn't make sense given their history, their training, their interests, and so on.
Along those lines, we've had several questions concerning how your students react or how they've proceeded without methodology. So I'm going to lump a few together and let you pick through them. So the first one is, how do your doc students respond to your sentiment, I'm not going to tell you what to do? And there also are some questions regarding what a lit review could look like and examples of how your students have approached inquiry without methodology. So if you could maybe give some snippets of ways your students have reacted or proceeded.
Well, I think if they're working with me or if they're taking my classes, you know, in every class I say, you're not reading enough. You need to go read more, read. I really and truly think that if they are reading, they will find things to do, that they will, you know, our doc students are smart. They come to us as very accomplished people, particularly in education. I have students who are in their 50s and 60s who've been had expert, maybe several careers, risen to the top of their careers and decide later in life to come back to academia. And I also, of course, have some new young students, but I think I just have to trust them and say, the more you read, the more you'll know, the more confidence you'll feel, the more expertise you'll have, and you have to trust yourself. Trust yourself. Think about what you want to do. What do you want to do next? Don't make it so big. What is the next thing you want to do about your dissertation or this piece of inquiry? What's the next thing you think you want to do? And they'll tell me something that seems very reasonable, and I'll say, well, go do that, and then let's talk some more. And then they come back and, what do you want to do now? So my job, I think, is to give them permission to use their expertise and try to encourage them to trust themselves, to inquire without me or some methodology telling them what to do. And they always come back with something. Or if they're stuck, I'll say, well, just be stuck for a while. Go to the beach, go to some movies, take a break, talk to some friends, do the things all of us do in our lives when we're stuck, and read something, pick up any book. I guarantee pick up any book and you'll get ideas. So it's not as if you should know what to do. This is inquiry. You know, Foucault wrote about having to start all over again. He said, I have to start all over again. And that's part of inquiry, the idea that it's quick and easy. You follow this little research process, boom, 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 you're done. I don't see that as inquiry. I don't see that as thought or very rigorous. So it's not like you should know what to do every minute. I don't know what to do. But I've got so many books on the shelf. If I had more time to read, I'd have a lot better ideas. I don't know whether I answered that, Erin. Give me some advice here.
Well, I think that's great. I do wonder, though, I think that maybe this goes against the inclination to leave it open, but I think that some people are wondering about specific examples looking back after that process has been engaged with, of how people have gone about in non-traditional ways. Could you share any stories?
Well, I think people do all kinds of different things. I can't ask Alicia Jackson that. She's one of my dark students. She'll be coming up here soon. Ask Alicia. So, I mean, you're asking for some specificity. I don't think I can give you. I'm not sure I can give you. People work through it differently. People work through what they want to do differently. And a lot of times this isn't so radical. It's not like it's so radical, like they're having to invent something from, whole cloth. They are doing the best they can do in the study they're doing. And you can push yourself only so far. And I always tell students, you can only be where you are. You can only be where you are. You have not read everything Deleuze wrote. Okay. You can only be where you are. Do the best with what you've got. Do your reading and then do the next thing. So, some of those dissertations are out there that people have written. Some people have done, I think, kind of radical work, and other people they pushed themselves as far as they could go. And that's what I think we want. So you start somewhere and then you just push yourself to do more. So it's not like you have to not like you have to be Deleuze in your dissertation.
I do want to mention too, in case attendees aren't aware, that on our website there is the list of suggested readings, and in the readings I feel that you included some really great examples of how people have pursued ideas and interacted with different concepts. So if you're not aware of those readings, please do look at the site.
What I do tell people to avoid is picking up some of these very complicated philosophical concepts, particularly those of Deleuze and Guattari, but other scholars as well, and dropping them down into a qualitative study. It's just very dangerous. So that's a real caution. That's a real no-no for me with a student, is to read a paper in which they've just picked up assemblage and they're looking for an assemblage in a classroom or something like that. They haven't studied Deleuze if they're doing that. And so that's really bothers me more than anything else.
Can I ask a question about institutional politics? Because we would like to do very exciting things with our students, but often you have committees, in institutions, which make it quite difficult. So this is one from a colleague in Cape Town. How do we do post-qualitative methodology when we're so constrained by institutional demands for ethical procedures, which force scholars into mainstream methodology and limit our imaginary of what is possible and impose the necessity of gaining acceptance through rigid committees that do not understand the inquiry we do? Do we have to dissemble in order to engage inquiry of ethical and just value within our institutions' frameworks?
I think this is very local. I think this is dependent on the country, on the institution, and the college. My college, College of Education at UGA, is very liberal. it has had a qualitative program ever since I came. It wasn't really a program when I came, but we were teaching qualitative courses at that point. Some parts of education, the psychology, some of the other more positivist areas, expect students to do particular kinds of work. But I have not had any trouble getting students through a dissertation. I haven't had trouble with committees, but I'm very careful in advising students to be sure they're selecting committee members who will support their work. Not saying that anything goes, but that they are not going to say, if you're doing this kind of study is not good. So, I mean, I think it depends on where you are, Viv. I mean,
yeah.
And I think part of that is educating our colleagues on what we're doing that's different from what they're doing. And of course, you know, there are people you just can never talk to. You would never convince them that even a simple qualitative study is legitimate. They're just never going to believe that.
Yeah.
So that's always going to be there.
Yeah. I think it is more difficult in some countries and institutions than others. You are right about that.
I do.
Personally, I was wondering if feminist methodology sort of spoke to you, because you seem to sort of look at mixed methods, quantitative and qualitative, but feminists for years have been critiquing, you know, sort of conventional research methodologies. And I just wondered where you located in that.
Well, I started off, feminist methodology was the first methodology I studied. And I mean, reading Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway and those early feminists who were inventing feminist methodology was powerful for me. And, but I don't want, I mean, I'm just hesitant with any labels. I guess that's why post-qual, you know, even post-qual is troubling. It might be a useful label. You might be able to do something you want under it, but there is nothing called post-qual, if that makes sense. But feminism is always there for me, Viv. It's always in front, and it is not a lens. I don't like that word. It's not a lens. I can't take feminism off and put it on. It has completely taken me up. So I'm always looking at things through feminist theory. And feminist methodology, of course, grounded much of early qualitative methodology. And it still does. The ethics, the insistence on solid theory, all of that was right there for me and stays there.
There's just a follow-up question. There were a few people who asked, you mentioned postmodernism and post-structuralism, the difference between the posts. So there have been a few questions about that. And after this, I'll hand over to Erin to ask a few.
Postmodernism, I see, I kind of use Patty Lather's differentiation here. Patty said that postmodernism is like the avant-garde in the arts and culture, like postmodern architecture and so on, and that post-structuralism is the academic critique of structuralism using postmodernism. So we have the structural period, and we have the post-structural period, which was a critique of structuralism. So post-structuralism is more academic, postmodern is more cultural and culture and the arts. I think the word postmodern was actually first used in architecture, I believe. So postmodern film, postmodern dance, but post-structural theory is the way I think about it.
Yeah.
But I think they are interchangeable, and I kind of use them depending on the context.
Along those lines, we had someone wondering if the blending of those two terms or labels was obscured, caused an obscuring to their detriment.
I'm not sure. if you were a student in my class, I'd want you not to just use post-structuralism if you were writing a paper, but I'd want you to be more specific, because post-structuralism is this kind of umbrella category for a lot of work that's very different from each other, So I'd want you to tell me the theorists you were using, to bring it down to the theorist or theorists, and even more specifically to the particular theory you were working with. Like, are you doing Foucauldian archaeology or something, be specific. But I don't know how to avoid some big term like post-structuralism, I think it's an indicator, it's a gesture toward a body of work, like feminist theory. What the heck is that? It's huge. It encompasses so much. So we use those terms for convenience.
So there was a question about the relationship between post-qual and resistance. And you mentioned a couple of times throughout your tenure that you've met some resistance, but just generally, if you could expand on that idea.
Post-qual, well, I think post-modernism, post-structuralism, the theorists I read in that body of work are all about resistance, refusal. And so post-qualitative is the refusal of qualitative. Post-humanism is a refusal of a particular description of human being. Post-modernism is a refusal of some of the ideas of modernism. So that's always there. And if you read those French guys, you will see this huge political activist. Their work is political and activist, and it's very ethical. It's about refusing what they see as dominance and dogma in particular, all kinds of oppression. So it does give you lots of ways to resist and refuse. Derrida says deconstruction is justice. Deconstruction is justice. So, if you want to be an activist, read some post-structural theory, it's right there.
I'll jump in with one that I'm seeing through the chat or through the Q&A right now is around writing. So several people are talking about writing and the social sciences, like versus or different from humanities. Do you see differences kind of in those two worlds? But also some people have asked about like Berard's quote that language has been granted too much power. And so advice or thoughts on how do you go about doing a lot of writing in the academy, but also not granting the linguistic power that Berard refers to when trying to write about relational or affective or material events unfolding in the world?
Well, I watched Laurel Richardson. Laurel was a sociologist at Ohio State. Her husband is a fiction writer, an English professor, a fiction writer. And when she wrote that paper, Writing a Method of Inquiry, the first draft of that paper, what she was doing was bringing an understanding of writing from the humanities into the social sciences. That writing is just not some kind of mopping up activity we do at the end of a study, but that writing is thinking, writing is inquiry. And for me, every kind of breakthrough I've had in my thought has come in writing. It's like I write something and I go back and read it, and it's kind of like, oh my God, where did that come from? It just writing, the thinking that writing produces has been powerful to me. I can read and read, but until I have to really write something, that's when I grapple with it. When I have to write one word after another word after another word, and I read that sentence, and that sentence sets up the condition for the next sentence, and those two sentences set up the condition. That is a movement, a kind of thought for me that is just magical. It's hard, but wonderful. I love it. So, but I'm a happy writer. I'm a happy writer. I'm an English major, philosophy major, so I'm happy writing. But some of my students are not, but they have other skills and other talents. But if you're going to be an academic, you might as well face up to the fact that you're going to have to write. You know, if you don't want to do that, go to business, you know, go do something else. But when you join academia, you're going to have to write. So you have to get your writing under your belt. And I've watched students do it. They start out, they're not very good writers, and they write really good dissertations.
We had a question from a doc student who asked, at what point do you stop reading and start writing?
Never stop reading, never stop reading, never. I mean, you know, if I have a student who insists on reading everything Deleuze wrote before they start writing, I'd say, why don't you take a shot at writing something? So you never stop reading. I mean, if you're reading, if you're just reading to avoid writing your dissertation, I mean, you know, usually people's money runs out. So you have to graduate, you have to finish, and you have to start writing. But, you know, I'm reading every minute I write. I start writing something and I realize I kind of know what that next sentence needs to be, but I'm not smart enough to write it. I have to stop and read for a week. I have to really stop and read. So reading and writing always go together. So I think that's kind of a false binary. When do you stop reading? You never stop reading.
We also had a question along those lines. If writing is inquiry, and this person agrees that it is painting or drawing or another creative process also inquiry?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And we have students now at UGA, and I'm sure at other institutions, who can do all sorts of things in their dissertation. They can include art and whatever they want to do. There are some limits, but, you know, I figure our job as faculty is to work with our institution so that our students can produce the kind of work they can do, which is much more interesting than what I write many times. So I think that's part of our politics, is to go talk to whoever we have to talk to and make the case, do the work for our students.
So we had a few people too ask specifically, they identified either as math educators or people that work in science technologies. Right. And they're interested in what you might have to say about post-qualitative inquiry and is it possible in fields such as math and science technology? What might it have to offer in those areas?
Whatever you want to do, whatever you want to do. I mean, it really is, I see post-qual as a space that is not constrained except for the constraints you put on it yourself to do some work that might be different than what you typically see in your field. And the label is out there now, and it's been legitimated. It's interesting how quickly it's kind of been legitimated and picked up. So that's surprising to me. So do what you want to do. Experiment, create, whatever your field is. Create your own name for it. Like Erin Price and I just edited a special issue of Qualitative Inquiry on new approaches to inquiry. And we asked people to name it. So Maggie McClure's name is divination. So name it, do something and name it. So we have many kinds of inquiry that aren't locked into one of those three big methodologies that are so constraining, I think. So do something and name it. If you need a label, you want to call it post-qual, that's fine, but name your own. So, you know, claim it, name it, claim it.
Well, Viv or Erin, do you have any other question that you want to maybe ask as our final question of today?
So one that seems to be recurring is, what advice can you give for those who get pushback from institutions or maybe have less supportive advisors and or supervisors? So being either as the doc student or the gatekeeper between the doc student and the institution, what advice could you give?
you just have to do the best you can. I think you have to pay attention to the resistance. Who's it coming from? Is it coming from one person? Is it this one person who's always putting the, you know, the stop sign in front of people? If so, maybe you need to have a conversation about research. Maybe you can organize some conversations in your college about what counts as good research so you can open things up. You'll have to compromise. We all have to compromise. I compromise all the time in my work at the university. I think you have to, my politics has been to do edit lots of special issues so that there are papers out there. I say, we just did a whole issue. You can cite all those papers. You can cite all those papers. So don't tell me you can't get some, you know, citational authority to do this. So you just, it's all local, it's all specific. You have to figure it out at the site. And don't be afraid of compromising in your dissertation. You'll have a career ahead of you. And you just do the best you can at the time.
Thank you. I think hearing that, that you've had to compromise is...
sure, we all do.
For many of us, right? That there's a permission that the dissertation is not everything in the sense that you do have. So do what you need to do maybe to get out the door and then continue to do the work you're really passionate about, you know, if that's the case at your institution. So we just want to say thank you for your time today, Betty, your generosity for talking with us for an hour and a half, your expertise, I think your honesty and transparency about yourself as a reader and a writer and a thinker, as a teacher and a mentor. So we really just appreciate your candidness with us all today. I think Viv is going to kind of close us off and wrap up today and share just a few announcements and things before we sign off for the day.
Yes, thanks very much to everyone involved. And also to our participants for joining us today. We had at one stage about 172 people, and they've sort of come and gone, I think. But this webinar has been recorded, and we're going to post information on how one can access it on YouTube. And also I'd encourage you again to subscribe to that channel, the YouTube channel, so that you can get updates every time a new recording is posted. And I just want to say our next webinar is Dr. Stephanie Springay, who's going to join us on October the 15th at 9:30 CST or 4:30 Cape Town time zone. And the suggested readings are posted again on the website. You can also contact Erin if you want to access them. Just Google the University of Missouri and Post-Philosophies and the Doing of Inquiry webinar series to find out more. And if you have issues accessing the recorded webinars or accessing the suggested readings, again, email Erin Price, and you can find her email address on the website. So thanks so much for joining us today and for spreading the word. And we look forward to seeing you again sometime. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Betty.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Betty.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
There was one last request for that 800 number.
Oh, okay. Just email me. It's okay.
Thank you for all your inspiration.
Sure.